The Nellis Air Force Base hangar was a cathedral of metal and memory, its cavernous interior echoing with the symphony of machinery and youthful bravado. Sunlight sliced through high windows, casting angular shadows across gleaming aircraft that stood like sentinels of modern aviation. But today, something different vibrated through the air, a current of raw, unfiltered disrespect that hung as thick as the smell of aviation fuel and polished metal. Frank Harrison moved with the deliberate care of a man who had long ago learned that precision matters more than speed. At 72, his body bore the marks of a lifetime of hard work, a slight stoop in his shoulders, hands gnarled like old oak branches, movements that spoke of past injuries and countless hours of meticulous labor. His faded blue coveralls, patched in several places, hung loosely on a frame that had once been muscular but was now whittled down by time and countless challenges. The P-51 Mustang before him gleamed like a silver bullet frozen in time. Its aluminum skin reflected the hangar's harsh lighting, each rivet and panel a testament to mechanical perfection. Frank's fingers traced its surface with a tenderness that seemed almost intimate, each touch revealing decades of understanding that went far beyond simple maintenance. A group of young airmen watched from across the hangar, their laughter a sharp-edged weapon meant to cut through the old man's dignity. Staff Sergeant Jake Rodriguez, a brash 25-year-old with arms covered in new military tattoos, nudged his buddy. "Would you look at that? They're letting museum pieces work on actual aircraft now?" The comment rippled through the small group, sparking a cascade of snickers and barely concealed mockery. To these young men, Harrison was nothing more than a relic, a walking anachronism in an age of digital diagnostics and computer-controlled maintenance. They saw only the slow movements, the trembling hands, the way his reading glasses constantly slid down his nose as he examined the aircraft's intricate systems. Private Tommy Miller, a lanky kid from Oklahoma with barely 2 years of service, joined in the derision. "My grandfather moves faster than this guy," he muttered, eliciting a burst of laughter from his fellow airmen. The sound echoed through the hangar, a cruel symphony of youth and ignorance. What they didn't see was the story etched into every line of Frank Harrison's face. Each careful movement was a language of his own. Where they saw hesitation, there was calculation. Where they perceived weakness, there was a lifetime of expertise that could diagnose an aircraft's condition with a single touch. His hands might have lost some of their former strength, but they had gained something far more valuable. The kind of intuitive understanding that comes from decades of hands-on experience. The P-51 Mustang was more than just an aircraft to Frank. It was a living memory, a connection to the most intense period of his life. Every rivet, every panel, every inch of his frame held a story that these young airmen could never comprehend. This wasn't just maintenance, this was preservation, a form of reverence that went beyond mere mechanical work. "Hey, old-timer," Rodriguez called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "You need help finding your walker. This isn't a retirement home." More laughter erupted, a cruel chorus that bounced off the hangar's metal walls. Frank didn't even turn. His concentration remained fixed on the aircraft, hands moving with a surgeon's precision as he checked a series of hydraulic lines. Each movement was deliberate, each touch communicating more than words ever could. Corporal Mike Chen, standing nearby, whispered to Rodriguez, "Look at how slow he is. How did this guy even get clearance to work here?" The comment was meant to be low, but it carried clearly in the hangar's acoustic space. The young mechanics continued their assault, each comment a calculated attempt to undermine the old man's presence. They saw vulnerability, an easy target for their youthful bravado. What they failed to understand was the depth of character standing before them, a man who had witnessed history, who had survived moments that would reduce these young soldiers to trembling shadows. But beneath those weathered hands and behind those slightly clouded eyes, burned something the young airmen couldn't see, a fire forged in the most brutal theaters of war, a spirit that had survived moments that would have broken lesser men. The combat wings pinned discreetly to his coveralls told a story of valor that these young soldiers couldn't begin to imagine. Frank Harrison remained unchanged, a steady and quiet dignity. His fingers continued their delicate dance across the P-51 surface, checking, adjusting, understanding the machine in a way that transcended mere mechanical knowledge. Each movement was a testament to a lifetime of skill, a silent rebuke to the mockery surrounding him. The hangar continued to pulse with mechanical energy and youthful derision, but Frank remained a singular focus of concentration, preparing An aircraft as if the fate of nations might once again depend on its perfect condition. Little did the young airmen know that the man they were mocking had personally saved more lives and turned more battles than all of them combined would ever do in their entire careers. His silence was not weakness, it was the profound quiet of a warrior who had nothing left to prove. As the mockery continued, the P-51 Mustang gleamed, a silent witness to the drama unfolding, a bridge between a glorious past and an uncertain present, waiting for the moment when true valor would be recognized. Lieutenant Michael Reynolds wasn't just another young officer passing through the hangar. At 32, he carried a reputation for seeing beyond the surface, a skill honed through years of military intelligence and a family legacy of service that ran deeper than most could comprehend. His father had been a combat strategist, his grandfather a World War II veteran who rarely spoke about his experiences. Those silent meals, those cryptic moments of reflection, had taught Michael the art of observation long before his military training began. The hangar that day felt different, charged with an energy that most would miss. Where others saw routine maintenance, Reynolds detected a narrative waiting to be uncovered. His eyes, still gray and perpetually analytical, swept across the scene with a laser-like precision that had made him exceptional in his field. Frank Harrison stood out like a singular brushstroke on a canvas of young, uniform-clad mechanics. The old man's movements caught Reynolds' attention immediately. It wasn't the slow, seemingly uncertain pace that most would notice. No. What struck the lieutenant was the absolute intentionality behind each gesture. Every touch of the P-51 Mustang was a calculated communication, a language of mechanical understanding that spoke volumes to those willing to listen. Reynolds moved closer, his approach casual, but deliberately measured. Years of intelligence work had taught him the value of proximity without intimidation. He watched as Harrison's hands moved across the aircraft's skin, fingers reading the metal like a blind man deciphering braille. There was a rhythm to the movement, a muscle memory that suggested decades of intimate knowledge. The young mechanics continued their barrage of mockery, their laughter a jarring counterpoint to Harrison's focused concentration. Reynolds felt a familiar tension building, the same feeling he'd experienced during countless intelligence briefings when something crucial was hiding just beneath the surface. His mind drifted to stories his grandfather had shared, rare moments when the old man would break his typical silence. Tales of P-51 Mustangs dancing through European skies, of missions that seemed to defy possibility. Reynolds had listened with the wide-eyed wonder of a child, never fully understanding the weight of those stories until years of military service had added context to his perspective. Something interesting, Lieutenant. The voice came from Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had noticed Reynolds' intense observation. Reynolds offered a measured smile, just appreciating craftsmanship. He responded, his tone neutral, but carrying an edge that suggested more than casual interest. The P-51 Mustang gleamed under the hangar's lights, a machine that seemed to exist between eras. To the young mechanics, it was just another aircraft. To Reynolds, it was a living piece of history, and Harrison was its most intimate interpreter. A subtle detail caught the lieutenant's eye. The way Harrison's left hand moved with a slight tremor, yet maintained absolute precision. Most would see weakness. Reynolds saw adaptation. He recognized the mark of someone who had learned to work around physical limitations, someone who had overcome challenges that would break lesser men. The combat wings on Harrison's coveralls were barely visible, almost hidden, but not to Reynolds. Years of intelligence training had taught him to notice the details others missed. Those wings weren't just a decoration, they were a story waiting to be told. Rodriguez and his fellow mechanics continued their jeering, their voices a constant background noise, but Reynolds was focused entirely on Harrison. The old man moved with a purpose that transcended the immediate task of maintenance. Each touch, each adjustment was like a carefully composed symphony, deliberate, meaningful, profound. Something about Harrison reminded Reynolds of his grandfather, that same quiet intensity, that ability to communicate volumes without saying a word. He remembered how his grandfather's hands would shake when holding a cup of coffee, but could steady perfectly when working on machinery. The parallel was uncanny. As if sensing the lieutenant's gaze, Harrison looked up. Their eyes met, a moment of profound connection. That lasted mere seconds. In that instant, Reynolds saw something that took his breath away. Behind those seemingly clouded eyes burned an intelligence, a depth of experience that was anything but diminished by age. The mockery of the young mechanics faded in the background noise. Reynolds knew he was witnessing something extraordinary, a master at work, a living connection to a history that was rapidly fading from memory. "Quite a machine," Reynolds said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. Harrison gave the slightest nod, acknowledgement, recognition, a silent communication that spoke more than words ever could. In that moment, the lieutenant understood that he was standing on the threshold of a story far more remarkable than anyone in the hangar could imagine. The P-51 Mustang gleamed, a silver testament to engineering and human resilience. And Frank Harrison continued his work, unaware that his quiet dignity was about to be thrust into the spotlight, ready to challenge everything the young mechanics believed they knew about heroism, expertise, and the true meaning of service. The combat wings caught Lieutenant Reynolds' eye like a beacon of untold stories, small, almost hidden, but gleaming with a history that demanded respect. They weren't just a decoration. They were battle scars, silent witnesses to moments of terror and triumph that these young airmen could never imagine. Reynolds knew military insignia like most people knew their own reflection. These wings were different. They carried a weight that went beyond standard issue, beyond mere military protocol. Each tiny detail spoke of missions completed, of challenges overcome that defied ordinary comprehension. The wings were World War II era, carefully maintained, their silver finish dulled by years of quiet reverence. To the untrained eye, they might have seemed like just another piece of metal pinned to faded coveralls, but to Reynolds, they were a cryptic manuscript waiting to be deciphered. He remembered his grandfather's stories, fragments of conversations shared over late-night glasses of bourbon, tales told in hushed tones that seemed more like whispered legends than actual memories. Missions over occupied Europe, dogfights that pushed the limits of human endurance, moments where survival was more about miracle than skill. Frank Harrison continued his work on the P-51 Mustang, seemingly unaware of the lieutenant's intense scrutiny. Each movement was a testament to muscle memory so deeply ingrained that it transcended conscious thought. The aircraft wasn't just a machine to him, it was a living entity, a companion that had shared the most intense moments of his life. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and his group of young mechanics had fallen silent, their earlier mockery replaced by an uncomfortable tension. Something had changed in the hangar's atmosphere, a shift so subtle yet so profound that even they could sense it. Reynolds took a step closer, careful not to disturb Harrison's concentration. The old man's hands moved with a precision that defied his apparent age, fingers reading the aircraft's skin like a blind man deciphering an ancient text. Every touch was a conversation, every adjustment a carefully composed sentence in a language of mechanical poetry. The combat wings glinted again, catching a shaft of sunlight streaming through the hangar's high windows. Reynolds found himself drawn to them, a magnetic pull of untold history. He recognized the specific configuration, a distinguished flying cross paired with multiple air medals, a combination that suggested extraordinary service during World War II. "Those must have some stories," Reynolds said softly, more to himself than to Harrison. For the first time, the old man paused. His hands, which had been moving with perpetual motion, came to rest on the P-51's gleaming surface. The silence that followed was charged with something more powerful than words. Harrison's eyes, which moments ago had seemed clouded and distant, suddenly sharpened. They were the eyes of a man who had seen things most could never comprehend, who had lived through moments that would define generations. The mockery of the young airman now seemed like a distant, childish echo. "Stories?" Harrison's voice was soft, gravelly, a sound that carried the weight of decades. "These wings, they're not just stories, Lieutenant. They're memories etched in blood and courage." Reynolds felt a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary maintenance worker. This was a living piece of military history, a man who had quite literally helped shape the course of human events. The P-51 Mustang seemed to come alive under Harrison's touch, no longer just a machine, but a time machine connecting past to present. Reynolds understood now why the old man moved with such deliberate care. Every action was a tribute, a preservation of something far more important than mere mechanical maintenance. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been watching from a distance, took an involuntary step forward. The mockery had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of something close to reverence. "Sir," Reynolds said, his military training tempering his genuine curiosity, "would you be willing to share some of those memories?" Harrison's smile was enigmatic, part pain, part pride, part something that defied simple explanation. The Combat wings seemed to pulse with their own light, a silent testament to missions completed, to brothers lost, to a kind of heroism these young soldiers could barely comprehend. Some stories, Harrison responded slowly, aren't meant to be shared. They're meant to be remembered. The hangar fell silent. The young mechanics exchanged glances, the earlier bravado completely stripped away. Lieutenant Reynolds understood he was witnessing something extraordinary, a moment where history was about to unveil itself, where the thin veneer of youthful arrogance would be stripped away to reveal something profound. The P-51 Mustang leaned, a silver guardian of secrets, waiting. Frank Harrison's hands returned to their work. But everything had changed. The narrative of the hangar had shifted, and everyone present knew they were standing on the precipice of a story that would challenge everything they thought they understood about heroism, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. Whispers of valor hung in the air, as tangible as the aircraft before them, waiting to be heard. The small conference room adjacent to the hangar felt charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights overhead. Lieutenant Reynolds had carefully arranged for a private moment, a chance to truly understand the man behind the combat wings. Frank Harrison sat across from him, a steady and quiet resilience, his weathered hands folded carefully on the table's surface. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly, a golden-brown landscape that seemed to mirror the vast skies Harrison had once navigated. Reynolds pulled out an old notebook, a habit from his intelligence training, a way of honoring stories that might otherwise be lost to time. The P-51 Mustang, Harrison began, his voice low and measured, wasn't just an aircraft. It was our lifeline, our guardian angel. We didn't just fly those machines, we lived inside them, breathed with them. The story began to unfold like a map of human courage. Harrison had been just 22 when he first joined the Army Air Forces in 1943. A farm boy from Minnesota who had never been more than 50 miles from home before the war. The transformation from a young man who had never left his hometown to a fighter pilot over Nazi-occupied Europe was a journey that defied imagination. His first mission came in the summer of 1944, a bombing escort deep into the heart of Germany. The skies over Europe were a hellscape of flak, enemy fighters, and constant, bone-crushing tension. Harrison described moments that seemed pulled from the most intense war films, except these were real, lived experiences. We'd take off before dawn, he recalled, his eyes no longer in the conference room, but somewhere far away. The P-51 Mustang was different from other aircraft. She was a dancer, not just a machine. Where other planes would struggle, she would glide. Where others would falter, she would sing. Reynolds listened, captivated. The notebook lay forgotten. This wasn't just a recounting of events. This was a poetry of survival, a narrative that spoke to the very essence of human endurance. Harrison spoke of missions that seemed impossible, protecting bombing formations against waves of Luftwaffe fighters, navigating through clouds of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky into a killing field of metal and fire. He described dogfights that lasted mere minutes but felt like entire lifetimes, split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. We lost good men, he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. So many good men. The P-51 wasn't just our aircraft. She was our promise, a promise that we would bring our brothers home. One story stood out, a mission over Berlin in February 1945. Harrison's squadron had been tasked with providing escort to a massive bombing run. The German defenses were at their most desperate, throwing everything they had into the sky. His voice became a rhythmic cadence of survival, describing how he had single-handedly protected a damaged bomber, taking on 3 Messerschmitt fighters while low on fuel and ammunition. I wasn't a hero, Harrison said firmly. I was just doing what needed to be done. The real heroes were the boys who never made it home. Lieutenant Reynolds saw something in the old man's eyes, a combination of pain, pride, and a profound sense of loss that transcended simple storytelling. These weren't just memories. These were wounds that had never fully healed. The P-51 Mustang represented more than a piece of military equipment. For Harrison, it was a time machine, a connection to the most intense period of his life. Each rivet, each panel held a story of survival, of brotherhood, of a generation that had been asked to do the impossible and had somehow found a way to succeed. After the war, Harrison continued, many of us struggled to find our place. The skies had been our home, our entire world. Coming back to normal life That was the real battle. He spoke of friends lost, of missions that haunted his dreams, of a brotherhood that existed beyond language or simple understanding. The young mechanics who had mocked him earlier would never comprehend the depth of what he was describing. Reynolds understood now why Harrison moved the way he did, why every touch of the P-51 was a form of reverence. This wasn't just maintenance. This was preservation. This was remembrance. The wings, Harrison said, touching the small insignia on his coveralls, aren't about glorifying war. They're about remembering sacrifice, about honoring those who didn't make it home. As the story concluded, the conference room seemed to expand. The desert outside no longer felt like empty space, but a canvas upon which the greatest generation had painted their most profound story of courage. Lieutenant Reynolds realized he was witnessing more than a historical account. He was receiving a sacred transmission, a bridge between generations, a reminder of what true heroism looked like. The ghosts of the sky had found their voice, and Frank Harrison was their messenger. The hangar transformed in an instant. Lieutenant Reynolds knew he was witnessing something extraordinary, a moment that would redefine everything the young mechanics believed they understood about heroism, expertise, and service. The story of Frank Harrison hung in the air like a tangible force, challenging every preconceived notion that had existed moments before. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stood frozen, his earlier bravado completely stripped away. The mockery that had filled the hangar now seemed like a childish whisper in the face of true heroism. His tattoos, once a symbol of youthful rebellion, now felt insignificant compared to the quiet dignity of the man before him. "How many missions did you fly?" Rodriguez asked, his voice stripped of its previous condescension. The question was a white flag of surrender, an admission of profound ignorance. Harrison's eyes, no longer clouded but razor-sharp, swept across the gathering of young airmen. 37 combat missions, he said quietly. 37 times I took to the sky knowing I might not return. 37 times I watched over my brothers, hoping to bring them home. The numbers hung in the air, each one a testament to courage that these young soldiers could barely comprehend. Private Tommy Miller, who had earlier made snide comments about Harrison's age, now stood with his mouth slightly open. The distance between mockery and respect had never seemed so narrow. Lieutenant Reynolds watched the transformation unfold. He had seen intelligence briefings, had studied psychological dynamics, but nothing compared to the raw human drama playing out before him. The power of a single story, told with quiet dignity, was reshaping the entire atmosphere of the hangar. 37 missions, Rodriguez repeated, almost to himself. The number was no longer just a statistic. It was a landscape of survival, a testament to human endurance that defies simple explanation. Harrison's hands returned to the P-51 Mustang, his touch now observed with a reverence that had been completely absent moments before. Each movement was no longer seen as the uncertain gesture of an old man, but as the precise communication of a master craftsman. "This aircraft," Harrison said, his hand tracing the Mustang's aluminum skin, "saved more lives than most people will ever understand. She wasn't just a machine of war. She was a promise of survival." The young mechanics moved closer, drawn by a gravity more powerful than their previous dismissiveness. Lieutenant Reynolds observed the subtle shift, the way professional curiosity transformed into something closer to spiritual attention. Corporal Mike Chen, who had been particularly vocal in his earlier mockery, found himself asking a question he would never have considered moments before. "Sir, how did you survive so many missions?" Harrison's laugh was soft, tainted with memories both painful and profound. "Survival was never about being the best. It was about being smart, about understanding your machine better than the enemy understood theirs." He began to describe technical details that left the young mechanics stunned. The way a P-51 Mustang could be coaxed into maneuvers that seemed to defy the laws of physics. How understanding an aircraft was more about feeling than measurement. How the relationship between a pilot and his machine was closer to a dance than a mechanical operation. Rodriguez felt something shift inside him. The tattoos that had once symbolized his sense of toughness now seemed like childish decorations compared to the living history before him. This wasn't just a man. This was a walking museum, a breathing connection to a moment in history that was rapidly fading from memory. "We thought we knew everything," Private Miller mumbled, more to himself than anyone else. The statement was an admission of profound ignorance, a recognition of how little they truly understood about service, about sacrifice. Lieutenant Reynolds saw more than just a change in attitude. This was a moment of profound education, the kind that couldn't be learned from books or lectures. This was living history transforming understanding in real time. Harrison continued his work on the P-51 Mustang. Seemingly unaware of the profound impact of his presence, each touch was a lesson, each movement a story. The aircraft was no longer just a piece of machinery, it was a time machine, a connection between past and present. "Remember this," Harrison said quietly, looking at the gathered mechanics. "Technology changes, machines evolve, but courage, dedication, those remain constant." The hangar, which had moments ago been a place of mockery, now felt like a sacred space. The P-51 Mustang gleamed, a silver testament to human resilience, to a generation that had been asked to do the impossible and had somehow found a way to succeed. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, extending his hand. "Sir," he said, "we owe you an apology." Harrison's smile was enigmatic, part acceptance, part acknowledgement that some lessons are learned not through words, but through understanding. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. The transformation began with a wrench. Not just any wrench, a carefully maintained tool that had likely seen as many miles as Harrison himself. Lieutenant Reynolds watched in absolute fascination as the old mechanic began to demonstrate the intricate art of aircraft maintenance, turning what could have been a simple technical inspection into a masterclass of aeronautical engineering. "Most people think maintenance is about replacement," Harrison said, his voice cutting through the hangar's ambient noise. "But it's really about understanding. Every machine tells a story if you're willing to listen." He moved around the P-51 Mustang with a grace that belied his age, each movement a carefully choreographed dance of expertise. The young mechanics who had mocked him earlier now stood in rapt attention, notebooks in hand, hanging on every word and movement. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found himself leaning forward, completely captivated. Harrison's hands moved with a precision that seemed to defy the tremors that had been so obvious earlier. What had appeared to be weakness was now revealed as a carefully adapted technique, a lifetime of learning how to work around physical limitations. "See this hydraulic line?" Harrison pointed to a complex network of tubes beneath the aircraft's skin. "Most would look at this and see complexity. I see a language, each bend. Each connection tells me about the aircraft's history, its challenges, its resilience." He began to explain the P-51 Mustang's hydraulic system with a depth that went far beyond STANDARD maintenance procedures. It wasn't just technical knowledge. It was a profound understanding that came from years of intimate experience. The young mechanics exchanged glances, their previous mockery now replaced by a sense of awe. Private Tommy Miller, who had been the most vocal in his derision, now asked the question with genuine humility. "How do you know all of this, sir?" Harrison's laugh was soft, tinged with decades of experience. "Knowledge isn't about age, son. It's about observation, about understanding that every machine has a soul, and that soul speaks to those willing to listen." Lieutenant Reynolds observed the masterclass unfolding. This was more than a maintenance demonstration. This was a living history lesson, a bridge between generations of aviation expertise. Corporal Mike Chen watched as Harrison demonstrated a technique for checking critical stress points on the aircraft's frame. What seemed like a simple touch revealed layers of understanding that went beyond any technical manual. Harrison could seemingly read the aircraft's condition through his fingertips, detecting potential issues that would require sophisticated diagnostic equipment. For younger mechanics, during the war, Harrison explained, we didn't have computers. We had instinct. We had understanding. A misalignment that might be a millimeter off could mean the difference between coming home or not. He began to break down the P-51 Mustang's complex systems with a clarity that left the young mechanics stunned. The aircraft was no longer just a machine. It became a living entity under Harrison's explanation. He spoke of aerodynamics, of fuel systems, of engine performance with a poetry that transformed technical knowledge into something closer to art. The Merlin engine, Harrison said, running his hand along the aircraft's powerful power plant, was more than just a machine. It was our heartbeat, our lifeline. Rodriguez found himself taking notes, his previous bravado completely replaced by a hunger for knowledge. Harrison demonstrated how to detect potential stress fractures, a technique that went far beyond STANDARD maintenance procedures. What looked like a simple touch revealed layers of understanding that would take years to develop. Technology changes, Harrison said, but fundamental principles remain constant. Understanding a machine is about feeling its rhythm, understanding its language. Lieutenant Reynolds saw more than just a technical demonstration. This was a masterclass in human expertise, a reminder that true mastery comes from decades of dedicated observation and experience. The P-51 Mustang seemed to come alive under Harrison's touch. Each explanation peeled back layers of complexity, revealing the aircraft not as a collection of parts, but as a living, breathing entity with its own history and soul. Most young mechanics look, Harrison said quietly, but few truly see. Maintenance isn't about fixing. It's about understanding, about listening. The hangar had transformed. What had begun as a space of mockery was now a classroom of the highest order. The young mechanics stood with notebooks filled, minds expanded, preconceptions completely shattered. Corporal Chen asked a question that seemed to come from a place of genuine wonder. "Sir, how long does it take to develop this kind of understanding?" Harrison's smile was enigmatic. "A lifetime," he said simply, "and even then, you're still learning." As the demonstration concluded, the P-51 Mustang gleamed, not just as a piece of machinery, but as a testament to human expertise, to the profound connection between a true master and the machines. They understand. The technical mastery had been unveiled, and nothing would ever be the same. The base commander's office was not a place of comfort. Its walls were lined with photographs of aircraft, medals, and memories that spoke of decades of military service. Lieutenant Michael Reynolds stood at attention, but his mind was anywhere but in this sterile, official space. Colonel James Harrington was a study in military precision, silver-haired, razor-sharp in his pressed uniform, with eyes that had seen more than most would ever understand. He reviewed the report about Frank Harrison with a deliberate, methodical approach that spoke of years of military experience. "Tell me again," Harrington said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Exactly what happened in that hangar." Reynolds recounted the story, not as a report, but as a narrative. He spoke of Harrison's technical mastery, of the transformation that had occurred among the young mechanics, of a living piece of military history that had been hiding in plain sight. The colonel's fingers drummed a steady rhythm on the polished wooden desk. "Do you realize what you're suggesting?" he asked, a hint of something, respect, perhaps even wonder, creeping into his typically clinical tone. Outside the window, a formation of modern fighter jets prepared for takeoff, their sleek lines a stark contrast to the aging P-51 Mustang that had become the center of this extraordinary story. "Sir," Reynolds began, "Frank Harrison represents more than just a maintenance worker. He's a bridge between generations, a living connection to a moment in military history that we're rapidly losing." Harrington pulled out a file, old, slightly yellowed, the edges worn. "Frank Harrison," he read aloud, "Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 silver stars, multiple air medals." He looked up, his eyes meeting Reynolds with an intensity that demanded complete attention. The story began to unfold further. Harrison wasn't just a veteran. He was a legend who had somehow fallen through the cracks of military recognition. His missions during World War II had been so classified, so extraordinary, that many of his achievements had remained hidden for decades. "There are missions," Harrington said quietly, "that were never fully documented, moments of heroism that went beyond what could be officially recorded." Reynolds remembered Harrison's stories, the way he spoke about protecting bomber formations, about missions that seemed to defy possibility. Each word now carried a weight that went far beyond simple recollection. The base intercom crackled to life. "Sir, we have the additional records you requested on Frank Harrison." What emerged was a story more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined. Classified missions that had saved entire bomber squadrons, tactical decisions that had turned potential disasters into strategic victories, a career of service that went far beyond the standard definition of heroism. The young mechanics, Reynolds explained, they saw an old man. They didn't see a hero. They didn't see a master of his craft. Harrington's laugh was soft, tinged with decades of military experience. The military has always been about more than just youth and strength. It's about understanding, about dedication. The colonel stood, moving to a wall of photographs. His finger traced the image of an old P-51 Mustang, similar to the one Harrison had been working on. "These machines," he said, "they're more than metal and engines. Their history, their memory. A decision was forming. Reynolds could see it in the colonel's posture, in the way his fingers continued to trace the photograph. "We're going to do something," Harrington said, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "We're going to ensure that Frank Harrison's story is not forgotten." The plan took shape quickly. A full recognition ceremony, documentation of his previously classified missions, a proper acknowledgement of a hero who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. "Some heroes," the colonel said, "don't seek recognition, but that doesn't mean they don't deserve it." Reynolds thought about the hangar, about the young mechanics who had transformed from mockers to students, about a man who had carried decades of heroism with such quiet dignity that most would have never noticed. The paperwork began to move. Military bureaucracy, typically slow and methodical, suddenly found a new gear. Classified documents were being reviewed. Mission reports from decades ago were being pulled from archives. "Lieutenant," Harrington said, "some stories need to be told. Some heroes need to be recognized." As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows across the base, a new chapter was beginning. Frank Harrison's story, a story of survival, of expertise, of quiet heroism, was about to be brought into the light. The P-51 Mustang in the hangar seemed to gleam a little brighter, a silent witness to a moment of long overdue recognition. Sometimes, heroes wear coveralls instead of medals. Sometimes, their battles are fought not with guns, but with understanding. And sometimes, the most important missions are the ones that happen long after the war has ended. The recognition ceremony was unlike any the Nellis Air Force Base had seen in years. The hangar that had once been a place of mockery now stood transformed, a cathedral of military history and human resilience. Frank Harrison sat in the front row, his weathered hands folded carefully in his lap. The combat wings he had worn so discreetly now seemed to shine with a light of their own, no longer hidden but celebrated. Round him, a generation of young mechanics, the same ones who had once ridiculed him, sat with a reverence that spoke of a profound transformation. Lieutenant Michael Reynolds stood to the side, watching as Colonel James Harrington began to speak. The words were more than just an official citation, they were a restoration of honor, a bridge between past and present. Frank Harrison, the colonel's voice rang out, represents more than a single soldier. He represents an entire generation of heroes who asked for nothing and gave everything. The citations were extraordinary. Missions that had been classified for decades were now being brought to light. Tactical decisions that had saved entire squadrons. Moments of courage that defied simple explanation. Each word peeled back layers of a story that had remained hidden for far too long. The P-51 Mustang leaned nearby, a silent witness to the moment. It was more than just an aircraft now. It was a monument, a living piece of history that connected generations. Harrison's eyes, those same eyes that had once seemed clouded, now burned with a clarity that took everyone's breath away. When he was called to speak, the hangar fell into a silence so complete that you could hear a single piece of paper drop. "I was never a hero," he began, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. "I was just a kid from Minnesota who did what needed to be done. We all were." The story he told was not of personal glory, but of collective sacrifice, of brothers lost, of missions that seemed impossible, of a generation that had been asked to do the extraordinary and had somehow found a way to succeed. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been the most vocal in his earlier mockery, now sat with tears in his eyes. The tattoos that had once symbolized his sense of toughness now seemed like childish decorations compared to the living history before him. "Technology changes," Harrison said, echoing words he had spoken in the hangar weeks before. "Machines evolve, but courage, dedication, those remain constant." The young mechanics listened, not as students, but as disciples. Each word was a lesson in humanity, in service, in understanding that true heroism is rarely about grand gestures, but about consistent, quiet dedication. Colonel Harrington presented Harrison with a series of medals, some new, some long overdue, but the most powerful moment came when he also presented a special citation to the group of young mechanics who had learned from Harrison. "This is about more than just recognition," the colonel said. "This is about remembering, about understanding that history lives not in books, but in the stories we share." The P-51 Mustang stood nearby, a living connection between past and present. Harrison's hands, which had maintained her so carefully, now seemed to symbolize something more profound, a bridge between generations, a testament to human expertise and resilience. Private Tommy Miller, who had once made snide comments about Harrison's age, now stood as an honorary guard, his posture reflecting a newfound respect that went beyond military protocol. As the ceremony concluded, something extraordinary happened. The young mechanics began to share Harrison's stories, not as something distant or historical, but as living lessons. They spoke of his technical expertise, of his lessons about understanding machines, about the profound connection between a true expert and their craft. Lieutenant Reynolds watched the transformation complete itself. What had begun as a moment of mockery had become a powerful lesson in human potential, in the power of quiet expertise, in the importance of listening and learning. Harrison's wife, Eleanor, sat in the front row. She had watched her husband carry these stories silently. For decades, had been the only witness to the weight of memories he had carried. Now, finally, the world would understand. As the ceremony concluded, Harrison approached the P-51 Mustang one last time. His touch was the same, careful, precise, filled with an understanding that went beyond simple maintenance. It was a farewell, a final communication with a machine that had been more than just a piece of equipment. It had been a partner, a lifeline, a connection to a moment in history that was rapidly fading from memory. The combat wings gleamed, the aircraft stood silent, and a generation learned the true meaning of heroism. In the quiet moments after the ceremony, as the hangar began to empty, something remained, a spirit of understanding, a connection between past and present, a reminder that true expertise, true heroism, knows no age. The P-51 Mustang continued to gleam, a silver testament to human potential, to survival, to the extraordinary stories that live within seemingly ordinary men.